Hey everyone, welcome to the CBT Nugget series for 70-413. I am Chris Ward, your friendly CBT Nuggeteer, and we're going to be taking a look at IPAM design, IP address management, some things to think about when you're putting this together for your Windows 2012 R2 server environment. This nugget is primarily going to be about designing for IP address management. So we're going to talk a little bit about IP address management and, of course, what's new for R2. Now, it's kind of interesting because IP address management was new for 2012. It was kind of a new thing that what we did, and now R2 has already improved upon it. So a lot of the things we'll see that's new in the R2 version is actually improvements upon the already new IP address management. We'll also take a real good look at design considerations. Remember, this is the designing and implementing a server infrastructure. Now, I'll briefly mention a few things that I think that you should go out and take a look at in the 70-412 Nugget series, but it definitely is all about design and implementing that server infrastructure that the 70-413 is all about. Now, for a lot of you, you've probably already used IP address management, or at least are familiar with what it's able to do. The four modules like IPAM, discovery, the multiple server management and monitoring capabilities, auditing and IP address tracking, things like that. But the things that you are going to need to know that are kind of not really covered here is, of course, some of how you configure it. What do you do with group policy objects, server discovery? Now, we'll show you a little bit. In fact, I'll actually mention one of the PowerShell commands that you can use with that. Then how to create and manage IP address blocks. I mean, that should be pretty straightforward. Migrating to IPAM, delegating administration with the RBAC, the role-based access control, and then even managing your IPAM collections. These are all things that I highly recommend. Great series, 70-412, R2, and that will give you the information. Just go straight to the IPAM nuggets, and that will give that information to you, and that way you can kind of build upon that when you hit the design, which is what we're going to look at next. Internet Protocol Address Management, or IP Address Management, or as we like to call it, IPAM, is all about, think about it, managing your IP address allocation. Definitely in your enterprise level environments, your larger networks, as you're going to see, because think about it, when you're managing IP addresses, you've got perhaps you got a couple of DHCP servers out here, right? You got my DHCP, and maybe I've got a DNS server out here, and you want to manage IP address scopes. Well, to manage it, for that scope, you have to go over to this server and manage it. Then you'd have to go over to this server and manage it. And even though you're using remote desktop or whatever, and you're trying to get in and do this, the problem is you're still having to do it on this server, and then you have to move over to this server, and you're doing it all manually, whereas with IPAM, you can do this all in one centralized location. The other thing is that IPAM allows you to collect statistics from not only your DNS and DHCP, but also NPS and domain controllers as well, which is kind of cool. Now, there are four modules, and just kind of a little review that we deal with here. And you have, of course, IPAM Discovery, which allows you to use Active Directory domain services to discover servers that are running. By the way, you can run them on 2012 R2 and regular, 2008 R2, and obviously 2008. By the way, it stops there. After that, it is not going to be able to monitor anything in the 2003 range. So once you hit 2008, you stop. But you can, a couple things you're going to discover, and you can monitor these, is domain controllers, DHCP, DNS, and with today's security environment, even NPS. You can take a look at these as well. So you can find these machines, and then you can either discover them or you can even add them manually if you want to. IP address space management. Remember what I was talking about, having to go and manually go to each one of these DHCP servers and deal with the addresses. Well, with IPAM, you can actually view, monitor, and manage all of the IP addresses in your IP address space. You can dynamically issue one, you can statically assign them, you can track address utilization, which is obviously a big one. Utilization. Let me see if I can still spell that. Especially in today's world of Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA and all those things where they're like, all right, who's managing this and who's doing that? Did you use a process? Well, it's good to have that utilization tracking. And then, of course, you can do this across multiple servers. So you can manage them and monitor multiple servers. So you can configure and edit DHCP properties and scopes. You can track the status of a DHCP scope utilization, and then take care of your DNS servers and check out your DNS zones and see how healthy they are. That's all handled by your IPAM. It's going to take care of that. And then, of course, and we kind of mentioned this a little bit, is operational auditing and IP address tracking. So use the tools, the event viewer, to track any potential configuration problems. You can get all the configuration changes that happen on these servers. So if a change is made on this server, or a change is made on this server, because you can still do that, by the way, it will then send that information in or track it on your IPAM server. So that's kind of cool, and that's basically what was introduced in the 2012 environment. Now, what's new in R2? We all know, number one, if you're installing R2 or upgrading to R2, you're like, hey, what are the bells and whistles? What are the toys that I get to play with now that I get the R2 version? And then, of course, if you're taking the 70-413, you need to know what's new, because what do they test on? You got it. They usually pull things that are new. Well, one big thing that's number one here on their list, and this is straight from Microsoft TechNet, by the way, improved RBAC. So your role-based access control, they add a few different roles, but you can also create your own roles. You do this, by the way, using PowerShell, which is always good. And so you can actually create new roles, and what you do is you take the existing roles and use those as templates, and then you can then base your new access on that template. You can remove maybe a few features and stuff. This, by the way, if you take my link series, I've shown people how you can do that, and it's kind of cool. So if you want to check that out on RBAC, it's kind of cool. I really like the feature sets that they've been adding to that. Instead of here's your user roles, you're stuck with them. No, but I don't want to give them that much, but yet the next one down is not enough. How can I get the best of both worlds? Well, that's the cool thing about creating your own user roles with RBAC. And plus, they give you a few more anyway in R2, not just I think there was 4 or 5 in 2012, and now they've added to that. You also have virtual address space management. Yay! That means that Virtual Machine Manager, VMM, can actually manage the physical and virtual IP addresses. So guess what? In 2012, you couldn't do that. Now you can use VMM, and it will actually track what's going in there. You can use new operations from IPAM on your DHCP servers. That's always good. And everybody's going to cheer on this. You can now use SQL. Yay! Now, which is funny. In fact, I think Don in the original series on 2012 for the 70-413 mentioned that it was kind of being they weren't being entirely honest with you. It was SQL. It was just an internal database called the Windows Internal Database, which was a SQL instance running on your machine. But now you can actually point over to a SQL database and use that, which is going to make SQL administrators and database guys much happier. There's a lot more you can do with the upgrading and migration support when you're moving from one system to another. And they've added an additional 55 commands into your Windows PowerShell. So obviously, a lot of that's going to be dealing with things like your improved RBAC, some of your VMM stuff, some of your improved management. All of that, obviously, you need to have that PowerShell support under the hood in order to handle those things. And so they've added an additional 55 commandlets that you can utilize with Windows PowerShell. Like I said at the beginning of this nugget, this is primarily talking about design for your IPAM. And again, this is something that if you want to have a successful IPAM implementation, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate things in place. Now, a couple of things to consider. Number one, the IPAM server must not be on a domain controller. Now, it needs to be, and it should be, a domain member. That's something to think about, okay? It must not be a domain controller, but it needs to be a domain member. So that is good Domain controller, bad, okay? So it means to be a domain member, not a domain controller. The IPAM server should be a single-purpose server. Now, remember, this is from Microsoft's TechNet. I actually went out and said, all right, what are the design considerations, the things you need to look at? And one of the biggest things was like, look, you should do this on a single-purpose server. Now, in today's environment with virtualization and doing all these kind of things, obviously it gets a little bit easier because you don't have to buy a separate piece of hardware and handle that kind of stuff, right? But in this case, you can go ahead and handle it on a single VM if you want to, but you know, don't get so wrapped up in the sense that, oh, what if I've got an application server or something and that's the only thing I got left? No, you can still utilize it, but just recognize that obviously you have to, if you are going to use this, there's going to be a lot of traffic going back and forth between your domain controllers, your DHCP servers, your DNS, and your NPS, and all those kind of things, okay? So just some things to think about. Now, to manage the IP version 6 address space, you need to enable IP version 6 on the IPAM server. Otherwise, it will not do any of that. You're going to want to sign into the IPAM server with a domain account, obviously, in order for you to be able to access, because it is a domain member. Plus, remember, you are going to be utilizing that RBAC. So that means you need to be a member of the correct IPAM local security group on that IPAM server. Well, how do you solve that? Sign in with a domain account, which is obviously going to be a member of that IPAM security group. Okay. Also, you want to enable logging of account logon events for the IPAM's IP address tracking and auditing feature. So that way you can get the so you're going to have to enable that on domain controllers and NPS servers in order for that IP address tracking and auditing feature to work within that environment, okay? So that's definitely important. Remember, this will be for the DCs and the NPS servers that you're going to do. Now, a couple of other things before we shut down here, and is to talk about some of the factors that you can do. Number one, IPAM can only manage a single Active Directory forest, okay? So one forest only, okay? Remember, we also said you shouldn't install the IPAM on a domain controller. They also recommend that you don't put it on a DHCP or DNS server. And it says don't put them on there. Now, in my demos that I'm going to do in the next nugget, I actually have it on a DHCP. Now, it doesn't kill everything, but what you essentially then have is an IPAM server is managing itself, and that can, you know, sometimes cause some problems. The other thing to think about is that IPAM servers do not communicate with each other. So if I've got one IPAM server, so here's my IPAM server. And let's say I'm doing I have a huge company, and I have the Eastern United States and I've got the Western United States. So this is for the West, and then I'll add another server, and this is for the East, okay? So basically, think of this, there's a line drawn here. There's a wall of separation, and even though they're all part of the same forest, they cannot communicate with each other. So this is, of course, going to be a distributed, or what Microsoft calls a distributed environment. You've got one here, you got one over here, and neither the twain shall meet, right? There is no communication or exchange of information between these two, and so that can be an issue if you have somebody that wants to know everything that's going on, because maybe this guy isn't taking care of, you have this one taking care of this DHCP server, and then this is a DHCP server, and then this is a DHCP server, right? And so this guy is communicating and talking and knows everything that's going on, but it has no idea what's happening over on this one. This guy, meanwhile, knows everything that's going on with this DHCP server, but it has no idea and cannot configure or do anything over on that unless, get this, unless you then add this DHCP server in order to be discovered manually by this IPAM server. Okay, so you would have to customize the discovery scope of each server in order for them to be able to talk to each other in that particular environment. So let me clear this off and start over with a couple more notes here. A couple of other things is how many, everyone always wants to know, and this can sometimes be one of those testable things, how many DHCP servers and DNS servers can I handle? Well, you can handle 150 DHCP and 500 DNS per IPAM server. Okay, so a single IPAM server can do up to 150 DHCP servers, that's a lot, and 500 DNS servers, which makes sense. You will usually have more DNS servers because obviously with your domain controllers needing access to that and, you know, Active Directory integrated systems and stuff like that, you know, you're obviously going to have more DNS servers in that environment. You can do up to 6,000 scopes, got that? And up to 150 DNS zones. So if you think about it, those zones, you know, you got your parent zone. Let's say you've got 500 DNS servers and you've got 150 domains and child domains in that one forest, right? Wow, that's a lot. And so you can do that. And so that's kind of cool. The other thing is, and this is mostly for monitoring sake, it will handle up to 3 years of forensic data. Okay? So up to 3 years of forensic data is going to be handled. And that can be, by the way, up to 100,000 users' information in a single database. But something to remember is you must manually, and this is important, manually purge the data. You cannot just go, oh, well, once it gets to that 3 years or that maximum amount, it will automatically start to save over that. No, no, no. There is no database purge policy. You have to do it manually. So if you do that over on your SQL database, and by the way, that's beyond the scope of this, but check out Garth's excellent SQL series, and you can see about how to clear and maintain your database and find out about how to purge that if you need to find that information. Okay? And this is kind of important. IP version 4, obviously, version 4 is where you have a lot of your strengths here. This is where you're going to have your utilization trends. I do this all the time. I try to put that Z in. Utilization trends and reclamation support is only good with IP version 4. It doesn't work with IP version 6. And this is, by the way, you can only do this on Microsoft products. So Microsoft DHCP, Microsoft DNS, this is not going to be able to control non-Microsoft products, okay? So just some things to think about as you are designing your server infrastructure when it comes to IPAM. So we took a look at how this works, some of the new things that have popped up in R2, as well as some design considerations. And then in our next nugget, we are going to take a look at some implementation that we can use in some server discovery and talk about invoking our GPO policy so that we're able to utilize our environment. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for joining me.